Hey, so as you just saw from that video, it was actually surprisingly good, despite the guy's accent. But having gone through that video, you should now have a pretty rough idea of the history of metals and how they came about. So the way I like to think about this section is when I think about this section, I think that the chemistry involved is really not that great. It's mainly just a history lesson. And so, the way that they describe the discovery of copper is a pretty common one. Sorry about that. Yeah, it's a pretty common way of how they came about and got copper. So another way in which I heard about it was a lot of the travelers used to have to, make long distance journeys every night. And what they'd do is that they'd go up to the mountains, and while they were camping in the mountain places at night, then they'd obviously have to make a fire. And because Earth was so rich in resources back at that time, you can imagine that there was probably a large abundance of copper in those areas. So as a result of that, these guys had lit their fire and they went to sleep and left the fire going overnight because obviously to ward off evil animals and stuff. And then they wake up in the morning and look at the fire, and then what they actually find is that they find these small pieces of metal in the fire. And so in a similar fashion, they took them back, realized that that was coming from the earth, got that resource, and there you have it. I mean, the history of copper is pretty self-explanatory. And what I always like to tell my students from this module as well is to think about the metals, and why the caveman actually needed metals. So obviously he needed tools, but as you go throughout a lot of history, I remember hearing quotes somewhere actually that throughout history, I mean, a lot of things are motivated by war, and surprisingly enough, that became the major use of metals, to obviously facilitate your weapons, because if you can beat the guy who you're trying to fight with your stronger weapons, then obviously you're going to have a bigger empire. Well, that's the thought process going on back then, and so that's why they had a whole bunch of metals. Now, where that guy actually stops in his video, I'll just say a couple of more things. So he obviously mentioned that they started getting into the whole use of alloys, and once they did realize the value of alloys, then they started looking for more metals, obviously. So the Bronze Age is probably a huge age in history. You guys obviously well aware of the fact that bronze was I think it was quite lightweight and much stronger than anything else I had at that time. And the only thing that was holding them back was technology, and technology is going to be pretty key in this section. Okay, technology. The major reason why we were held back from discovering more things was the fact that we couldn't actually produce metals of that sort. And further on in this little hub, we're going to talk about technology involved in making metals and all that. With iron, the way they went about making it was they actually needed a much higher temperature within the blast furnace than they could actually obtain. And the only way for them to obtain higher temperatures was to plug in, to push in more oxygen. And they weren't actually able to do that. In fact, funnily enough, it's been shown in history that China actually came up with those metals first, because they were actually able to develop two-way bellows. So, the bellows like compressing air into a little interaction here. Bellows like push in and compress air through the front there. And what they would do in the medieval times is that they push the air through one side, and then they'd have to refill the bellow with air again, and then push it again. But the Chinese managed to develop a system which was, pushes air, pushes air, pushes air, pushes air. So they can get much more oxygen, and as a result, they actually found a whole bunch of metals first. Finally, so just having talked about iron, and the fact that they needed high temperatures, they weren't able to obtain those technologies. We'll just talk about one last metal, and that's actually aluminium. And we'll do a little bit more on aluminium in some of the future sections, but at the specific moment, we'll just talk about why they weren't actually able to get aluminium as a metal that they could use back at that time. So the reasons behind that is because that aluminium actually when you guys have done the experiment in the laboratory, you'll actually notice that when you're looking at aluminium, it actually looks a little bit powdery white. And what you'll do is that you'll scratch the surface of aluminium and actually notice that there's something underneath. If you wait a couple of minutes, that little white coating will reform on the top, and that's actually aluminium oxide. And aluminium is pretty reactive, so it reacts with the oxygen in the air and forms that little coating over the top. What that coating actually is, like we just mentioned, is aluminium oxide. And so you can see aluminium is pretty reactive, and it's reacting with the oxygen in the air. So that kind of goes against two things that they were already trying to do. They were trying to get more oxygen to a blast furnace, but if you're adding more oxygen, then you're going to form aluminium oxide more quickly. So you can't actually make aluminium in that way. You can't actually make aluminium through the use of fire. We actually have to use a different process known as electrolysis to obtain aluminium, and we'll go into that a little bit later. So in this last bit, I just want to talk about the metals that we're using now, and actually, things have really developed. A lot of the applications we use nowadays, we have metals that are really lightweight, but also very, very strong. Aluminium is actually one of the best examples for that. And other things, stainless steel is pretty incredible, and there are all these other metals that we use pretty much all the time. So I'll wrap my little section up there, and that should cover you for the first start point if you can manage to get the gist of some of the things that I've said. As a final note, I thought I'd just tack this on at the end of the video, but the questions that are usually asked in this section to do with, they're just asking you about history. So when you talk about these things, it can be pretty general and pretty broad, but just as long as you're covering the fact that the major limiting factor about them doing their metals at that time is actually the fact that they didn't have the technology or resources to do that sort of thing. And they're still looking for different ways. They didn't fully understand the chemistry, but that didn't seem to be that important when they were discovering the metals. Alright, we'll leave it there.